The last time we spoke on Coffee Break Tennis, the main theme of the show was that no matter what someone's title, no matter how much of an authority they seem to be, like the organizers of the Miami Open, no matter what they tell you, you really can't believe it because in these troubled COVID-19 times, no one really knows anything. We can't trust anyone because no one knows anything for sure. No one knows anything definitively. Well, since the Miami Open told us just days before canceling that they were still going to have the tournament, a lot of other things have been canceled. We already lost the Olympics. There will be no Olympics this year. The 2020 Olympics are now the 2021 Olympics. The French Open, of course, has moved to September, just about a week after the U.S. Open ends. Talk about a turnaround. Many people are already speculating that Rafa Nadal will skip the U.S. Open to give himself a better chance at the French Open, because who wants to go from the U.S. Open to the French Open? That's the worst clay court warm-up ever. The Laver Cup has been caught in the middle of that, which we will literally have the Laver Cup going on at the same time as the French Open. And the latest news out of that is that the Laver Cup is still holding their ground, saying they're not going to change their date. So we've got a scheduling war going on. And now the biggest piece of news of all, what will happen? We already know the clay season's gone, unless there's some kind of clay season in September. And who even believes that that will definitely happen? Now we're wondering what's going to happen to Wimbledon. The big news of this week has been that Wimbledon has announced next week they're holding a big meeting to definitively figure out what they're going to do. And they've already said that they don't want to play with empty seats. That's not an option. That leaves them two other options. Postponing, pushing it further ahead like the French Open, although since the French Open, as many have said, went rogue in that decision, they kind of took away some of the prime spots for Wimbledon and the U.S. Open to push into. And many are speculating we only have really for Wimbledon the third option. 1, play without fans, not going to happen. 2, postpone the date, doesn't look good. And 3, cancel Wimbledon, no Wimbledon in 2020. We are less than a week away from definitively finding that out. And that would be the only way in these troubled times that we live in here at COVID Break Tennis. That would be the only way to be sure. If Wimbledon wants to get together next week and have a definitive answer on what's going to happen this year of Wimbledon, there really is only one answer that anyone can trust is a surefire thing, and that's cancel the most important special Wimbledon to all the tennis fans, or mainly the Federer fans, out of the whole year of tennis. That's what it looks like is going to happen. But we will talk about the chances that it doesn't and many other things in today's edition of Coffee Break Tennis. Welcome to Coffee Break Tennis. Today on the show, many of you suggested previously that I should change the name to COVID Break Tennis. It is indeed a break from tennis due to COVID-19, the coronavirus. Today on the show, we've got this article. Somebody, a secret source that the Guardian, the UK Guardian, has spoke to, has basically said it's pretty much guaranteed Wimbledon will be canceled for 2020. We've got some more stuff on what is going on in the UK, since we always hear the ATP, the tournaments, the WTA, they always say we're working very closely with the government and health organizations, blah, blah, blah. Well, the government in the UK is basically Boris Johnson and the entire cabinet has become the Corona cabinet. They all got the coronavirus pretty much. So that doesn't sound very promising. We do have the latest, though, on some revisions that have been made. It seems like always with the media, you want what gets clicked the most, and you get a lot of stories that are worst case scenarios, but it does look like some of the experts who are advising the UK government, who the Wimbledon is talking to as they make this big decision coming next week, some of them are revising how bad it looks like things will be in the UK. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Roger and Rafa and Nole don't agree on what to do with the season, but they do agree on donating money, and they're encouraging a lot of other athletes to donate money, mainly for ventilators, which if you've been following this stuff, that seems to be the number one thing. People need more ventilators in hospitals because people who really get hit the hardest by the coronavirus can't breathe on their own without a ventilator. So that's pretty awesome. Of the big three, we've got the latest from the ATP and the WTA talking about when tennis will resume. I'll give you a hint. They don't really know, but we'll go over what they've said. I found an interesting article here saying that basically the French Open did what they did to beat the U.S. Open and Wimbledon to the punch. They just basically assumed someone's going to go for it. So why not us? despite making everyone very angry. Rafa Nadal may skip the U.S. Open, according to Todd Woodbridge. We'll see what he had to say. And, of course, we'll talk about the surface change at the U.S. Open, which many are saying means the U.S. Open is going to be even slower for all of eternity. All that on today's edition of Coffee Break Tennis. Let's go right into, this is from digitaltveurope.com, but the main source in here comes from the UK Guardian. Wimbledon organizer schedules emergency coronavirus meeting for next week. This is as of March 27th, which is today. Organizers have maintained that the tournament, scheduled to take place on June 29th to July 12th in the titular Southwest London locale, that means it's named after Wimbledon. That's the locale, would go ahead as planned, but the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson's forecast to have coronavirus beat within 12 weeks, seemingly less likely with each day. The club is looking to act now. And of course, the next story we have here is that Boris Johnson himself now has the coronavirus. How crazy is that? In a statement, outgoing AELTC, All England Lawn and Tennis Club Chief Executive Richard Lewis said the body's working hard to bring certainty to our plans. They want a definitive answer, but right now, where everything stands, you can't give anyone a definitive answer unless your answer is, we cancel. That's the only way you can be sure that what you're saying is actually true. As it stands, the likelihood of Wimbledon going ahead as planned are 0 to none, said one source cited by The Guardian. This is a secret source. We all know that sometimes secret sources you can't trust, but I mean, it already seems like this is what's going to happen. So let's take a listen to what the secret source had to say over at The Guardian. This insider, I guess from the All England Club, said that with such uncertainty about changing big, long-term contracts and setting mutually acceptable new dates, it's difficult and complicated, as can be seen from what has been happening with the Olympics. Of course, they canceled the Olympics for this year. The report goes on to say that while the All England Club privately admits the games won't go ahead, meaning in private, they're not putting it out to the press yet, but a lot of people know it's not going to happen. There's said to be division within the body of the All England Club, or the governing body, about whether to be proactive or follow the government's official stance. Calling the event off now would also have ramifications for potential insurance claims, with the All England Club being able to argue the decision has been taken out of its hands should the government extend its ruling. Basically, if the government forces Wimbledon to shut it down, they have no say, therefore they're covered, and insurance will actually pay them to cover all the ticket sales when they refund people for their Wimbledon tickets. Even if it were to be delayed, the source said it is unlikely that the All England Club will look to fill the gap left by the Olympic Games, which were officially postponed earlier this week. So that nukes one big idea a lot of people have been talking about. I've seen it on Twitter a bit. People are saying, hey, just put Wimbledon when the Olympics was going to be, right before the U.S. Open, and that doesn't look like a possibility. So let's talk about canceling is what it looks like is going to happen. But let's talk about if they were to postpone. This is from inews.com.uk. And I thought this was interesting, a little article here. I can't remember the name of the writer, but if you look it up over it, the headline is, Will Wimbledon 2020 be canceled? The three options facing organizers amid coronavirus outbreak. And let's just skip to the option of postponing Wimbledon. What does that entail? The timing of the U.S. and the French Opens, which of course they moved to September, means that Wimbledon only has a small window in which to reschedule. The window is very small because the grass surface limits the event to the summer months. I guess grass doesn't work in the winter. I'm not a grass expert, so I don't know. Some of my friends in high school were grass experts, though. Since the tournament was due to run from June 29th until July 12th, a new start date would have to be at least 1 month later to be meaningful, which would place Wimbledon dangerously close to the U.S. Open, scheduled to start on August 24th. While technically possible to conclude on August 9th, assuming a new start date of the 24th of July was agreed, there is no way of knowing at present what the new normal might look like as the world begins to ease out of lockdown. Allowing people out of their homes to return to the workplace in a controlled way is one thing. Permitting mass gatherings at Wimbledon, well, that is an entirely different thing. Meanwhile, as we know, governing body of Wimbledon, the All England Lawn Club, they're over there, debating on what to do, and they're consulting with the government and the medical experts. And here's what's going on with the government. The Prime Minister and the Health Secretary are now both in self-isolation, while Professor Chris Whitty, the UK's Chief Medical Officer, is working from home after he has developed symptoms. The three most important people in the UK government dealing with this now have coronavirus. That certainly can't be good for Wimbledon. And I feel bad for them. I know this it's crazy, so it's almost funny because it's so ludicrous, but I do want to put that out there. We should all feel very bad for the three members of the UK government. We should all feel bad for Health Secretary Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson, and of course the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, who all have symptoms now.
That's right.
There we go.
Man, that sucks!
The article goes on to basically say there's a lot of people are demanding to know what happens if Boris Johnson can't continue his duties, if his coronavirus symptoms become worse and worse, what will happen, and they name who will take over. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab. I don't know how to say it. And then they say, well, what if something happens to him? What if he gets coronavirus and he can't do his duties in the government because his symptoms are too terrible, too strong. He has to go to the hospital, put him on a ventilator, something like that were to happen. What happens then? And the government basically said, we have a plan, but we can't divulge it publicly yet. And then a bunch of people in the media are very angry and want to know right away. So that's where that stands. But I will say, this article is pretty important to me. Now, really quick, let's talk about this from the UK Express. This headline here, Roger Federer, Rafa Nadal, Novak Djokovic disagree about how to continue the 2020 season. Basically, Novak Djokovic, he just wants to start in 2021 or like really late in the year for 2020. He's saying pretty much cancel all of 2020. Nadal and Federer are basically saying, let's wait and see. So let's read a little bit here from the UK Express. The three biggest names, Roger, Rafa, Novak, in men's tennis are reportedly at odds over how to restart the tennis season. According to the Daily Mail, the world number one, Djokovic, prefers a lockdown for the season to start again much later in the year or next year, 2021. That's Team Djokovic. But then the report adds that Federer and Nadal are keen on a wait and see approach in the hope of tennis being played this summer. Last year, blah, 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 blah. Okay, we don't need to know that. So a lot of people are basically saying it looks like Wimbledon is doomed, and this is what I've heard from the ATP. We'll look at it in a second just to be sure, but if I remember correctly, the ATP is basically saying, we hope to come back for the grass season. We know that's unlikely. We really think the best chance is to come back for the U.S. hard court season and to go to the U.S. Open. So I guess that would mean we'd have tournaments like Cincinnati, the Masters of Cincinnati, the Masters in Canada, and of course the U.S. Open, and then somehow we'd go right over to clay. But real quick on the UK before we move on, this is a good sign for Wimbledon. This guy, epidemiologist Neil Ferguson over at the Imperial College London, he's made a model, if you've been following the news closely about the virus and things going on around the world, you've probably heard this guy's name, or at least you've heard of the Imperial College London model, the Imperial Model. I've seen it in several media outlets around here, and basically what it predicted, and they've changed it, mainly because of all the social distancing and the self-quarantine and all of that. They've changed the model because, models are only as good as the information you put into them, so they've had to adjust what information they put in. Originally, they put in everything goes on as normal. No one's quarantining or social distancing or staying home from work, working from home. And they predicted that millions of people would die in the U.S. and 500,000 in the U.K. Well, now he has revised that. Neil Ferguson has said that expected increases in National Health Service capacity and ongoing restrictions to people movements have made him reasonably confident the health service can cope with the predicted peak of the epidemic, and it arrives in 2 to 3 weeks. We've heard that in a lot of places. So that puts us somewhere in April. We're going to see the peak, and then things are going to go down, and then life may come back to normal. We may have tennis tournaments, or what I think, we're more likely to just see people go out, go back to work. People are still being very cautious, and music festivals, giant sporting events, probably not going to happen. We may have the Djokovic model, I'm sad to say, where there's not much happening this year. So keep in mind, this guy predicted 500,000 deaths in the UK. He's now saying deaths from the disease unlikely to exceed 20,000, could be much lower, and he's also said that half of those people likely would have died this year anyways, but the COVID-19 is going to speed that process up. As many of you, I'm sure, already know, a lot of people have been talking about it. Originally, I think some people took this as a sign that young people are immune, which is obviously not true, but people who are older and maybe have some lung problems, have had a heart attack recently, things like that, where their immune system is already compromised, they really have no fighting chance unless they're hooked up to a ventilator. And even then, you just kind of leave them on there, and there's really nothing else you can do to help them. It's very sad. Then they're expected not to make it. So that's why this number looks much better than 500,000. And more importantly, for our story, for our tennis story here, is that the UK government has been taking a lot of advice and consulting with this guy and the Imperial College Model as they come up with their next plan, their next move of how to deal with the virus, with the COVID-19 virus, which means there is a small chance between now and next week when Wimbledon makes their final decision that maybe they'll see that they say they want a definitive answer, which is why I think it's looking like we're going to get a canceled Wimbledon, but there is a possibility that since things are looking a little bit better, not as bad as we originally thought, give you a little bit more from this article really quick to give you an idea. Here it says the UK government is aiming to relax restrictions on people's movement, but only when the country has the ability to test more people for the virus. Some have criticized the UK for not following the advice to test from the World Health Organization, but Ferguson pointed out they couldn't do that, just like here in the US, because they didn't have enough tests to start testing everybody. However, Ferguson has said the UK should have testing capacity to test as many people as they need to, like what we've seen in South Korea. We have a bunch of information here on what's going on in South Korea, but I really don't want to bore you with a bunch of numbers and science and stats and all that stuff. But take it from me, who's read all this very thrilling and exciting stuff. Within a few weeks, the UK should have the testing capacity to copy what South Korea has done, aggressively test and trace the general population. His comments come as a team from the University of Oxford released provisional findings of a different model that say it shows up to half the UK population could already have been infected, which is actually, that sounds horrible, that's actually a good thing. If so many people get this virus and show very little symptoms, just think they have like a basic cold and don't realize what they have. So basically that gives me a little tiny bit of hope that maybe, since things don't look nearly as bad as they originally thought, and still, again, like with everything, nobody's sure of this, and those numbers, they rely on the fact that people are not going to things like Wimbledon. But maybe we could argue Wimbledon will say, let's take a wait-and-see approach like Roger and Rafa want them to do, and not Novak Djokovic, who wants to wait until next year. So there you go. If I had to bet on it right now, I say Wimbledon gets canceled, but I think there's a tiny chance they say they're going to try to wait a little longer and see. It's just, there's so much money tied up in it, and you got to do so much to get the grass courts ready for play. It just seems so unlikely. We have a sliver of a chance, folks. We'll talk about it next week. We'll have a show to talk about whatever happens with Wimbledon. Real quick on South Korea. A lot of people probably wonder, why is South Korea doing so well? Here's an article, sciencemag.org. Coronavirus cases have dropped sharply in South Korea. What's the secret to its success? The secret is they've dealt with this kind of thing before, and they were just more prepared than pretty much anyone else in the world. Here's one key paragraph from this article, and then we'll move on back to tennis-related stuff. South Korea learned the importance of preparedness the hard way. In 2015, a South Korean businessman came down with the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which you may remember as MERS. MERS, after returning from a visit to 3 Middle Eastern countries, he was treated at 3 South Korean health facilities, was diagnosed with MERS, blah, 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 blah. And then basically he spread it all over, and they had a crisis in South Korea, if you remember the news from 5 years ago. And basically, the South Korean government said, never again, and they put in place procedures and things that are working today to help them prevent the spread. They're able to test. They have much more tests available than anyone else around the world. They're able to test more. They're able to isolate. They're able to figure out where is the disease spreading. They've done something where they can trace you through your phone to see where you had been and who may have been infected when you were there. If that sounds scary to you, it's definitely happening in a lot of places around the world. I guess I would say I don't want people spying on me, the government spying on me, but if it helps control the spread of a disease like this, then it can't be that bad. It is working in South Korea. And in the UK, they think they're only weeks away from being able to do something more like the South Korean model. So we'll see if that does anything to help Wimbledon. I think it's probably too late. The latest out of the US is in New York. They're noticing that the spread is slowing down. That's a good sign. So it's a good sign for the U.S. Open. That other stuff is probably a good sign for the U.S. Open. But let's talk about the actual U.S. Open and the French Open. French Open, forceful coronavirus rescheduling in attempt to leave Wimbledon without, it is alleged. Swiss Fed Cup captain Heinz Gunthardt over here has a theory on why the French Open jumped ahead of everyone else despite all the criticism, and I think his theory is pretty sound. Let's take a look at what he had to say. It's very possible that Wimbledon and the French Open cannot take place as planned. But what the French did, they were the first to book this optimal date in the autumn, as late as possible in the autumn, but still early enough to be able to play outside. Perhaps the U.S. Open and Wimbledon would have liked this date, so the French Open rushed ahead and secured that date first. Now, we already have a debate about what should happen to Novak Djokovic's weeks at number one ranking record, if he should be able to overtake Sampras and Federer, and we'll do that next, and we'll get out of here. If he should be able to overtake the guys who hold the higher records to him, Sampras and Federer, or if it should be frozen since there is no tournaments to be played. And I tend to agree with that. I think you shouldn't count these weeks because no one is playing, even if it did look like Djokovic was perfectly set up to keep winning and to hold on to that ranking for a long time. I think since the whole tennis world is frozen, we should freeze that as well. So just imagine if people are already debating that about, should Novak's weeks at number one count? If they do count them, many people are going to say it needs an asterisk because it doesn't count. Deep down, we all know it, the true tennis fans. What are people going to say if they cancel Wimbledon but don't cancel the French Open? And a lot of people skip the French Open because they chose to play the U.S. Open, while people like Federer and other top players decide to play the Laver Cup if it goes on at the same time, if everything happens as scheduled today. If all that were to happen, what are people going to say about Rafa tying Roger 2020 in the slam count if he wins a French Open where many top players didn't come? And also on top of that, you can say that Federer didn't have a chance to get ahead of him by winning Wimbledon. A lot of people thought Federer had a chance to win Wimbledon this year. Let's say Federer plays Wimbledon next year, doesn't win, and then people say, well, it's because he was almost 40. He really needed to do it in 2020 by 2021. Federer is just a little too old to do it. That could really complicate an already very complicated GOAT debate. So comment on this, too. I want to hear what you have to say about this French Open business. It sounds like that's exactly what happened. It sounds like the French Open knew, everyone kind of knew, and the French Open, they went first. They shot first. So does that make you angry at the French, or does that make you kind of appreciate the nerve they had to make sure their tournament goes on while knowing that somebody else is going to have to cancel, and they say, it ain't going to be us? Comment below what you think about that. Real quick, from the Laver Cup organizers, we intend to hold Laver Cup 2020 as currently scheduled. So here they're talking about how the dates are overlapping with the French Open, but the dates are already sold out and scheduled for September 25th through 27th at the TD Garden in Boston. Raises many questions. We are assessing the situation, but at this time we want our fans, sponsors, broadcasters, staff, volunteers, players, and the great city of Boston, all of them, to know that we intend to hold the Laver Cup 2020 as currently scheduled. I'm not in the shoes of the French Open, said Craig Smiley Tiley, the tournament director of the AO. I'm not in the shoes of the French Open to the French Tennis Federation, so I can't comment on decisions they make, but I'm confident it will eventually work out. So a lot of speculation on what that all could mean. Maybe they have a feeling that things aren't going to work out for the French Open after all. That I don't know. I mean, can tennis kind of gang up together? We know tennis is split up by all these different governing bodies. The majors all have their own governing bodies. You have the ATP, you have the WTA, you have the ITF. Are they all going to somehow gang up and stick it to the French Open later this year? Is that what Craig Tiley Smiley thinks is going to happen, and why he's so confident things are going to work out? Good question indeed. Nadal may skip the U.S. Open, according to Todd Woodbridge. The U.S. Open is brutal in terms of heat and recovery. The French is brutal because of the physicality that is required of playing on clay. It really does open up the possibility of players choosing one or the other. Again, back to the GOAT debate. If many top players think they have a better chance at the U.S. Open than the French, and they skip it, they skip the French, or they skip the U.S. Open to play the French, I mean, it's going to water down the victory a little bit, you know? I mean, if Nadal has to beat Djokovic and team, obviously that doesn't happen anymore, but it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with that. This is an article. They switched to the surface at the Miami Open, which I thought played kind of low and fast enough. Miami looked all right to me, but it says right here that the new surface that's the same at the Miami Open and the New York Open is going to be at the U.S. Open and is going to be slow. Lots of people are angry about making the U.S. Open even slower, but hey, that's no surprise. They've been making it slower every year. Now they're just going to finalize it. I will say, though, why did the Miami Open have such a nice low bounce? And Federer did so well there if it's so slow. ATP shares updates on plans to resume season. Here's the expected date. Goes without saying that full cooperation with the other governing bodies is essential. We are in close discussion with all the grass court events, and they remain on calendar as scheduled at this time. The reality is this is a rapidly evolving situation, and there's no other option than to take this day by day, week by week, said ATP chairman Andrea Gaudenzi. WTA chief, though, he has said a little bit more than the ATP chief. The WTA chief, Mr. Simon, has said, we're looking at the data and obviously taking all the information received from the medical experts. The WTA and tennis is unique because it's global. Currently, here's the important part. We're hoping to play again during the grass court season beginning June 8th. But realistically, we are looking at the data and we realize that it could be delayed even further. Hopefully, it will be June, but if not, we are hoping that it will be during the summer hard court season in the United States. So there you go. That's just more evidence that there will not be a clay season or a grass season. There will be the U.S. hard court summer season, and then there'll be some kind of thing with a French Open thrown in immediately after. We'll see. Final thing, and then we'll get out of here. I got some more stuff in there, but we're running out of time, about Federer, Nadal, Djokovic giving money. I even saw Ana Ivanovic, former WTA number one, who's retired now. They're all giving money, a lot of money, in fact, and it's mostly going to get new ventilators into hospitals. So bravo to them. I hope as many people who can afford it contribute to something like that as well, because we need it. Pundits call for Novak Djokovic number one status to be recognized throughout the tour suspension. So Brad Gilbert told ESPN that, quote, he earned that ranking and he was going to be number one for a while. Hit the music because we're getting out of here, even if things went on as normal. Going into Indian Wells, Djokovic was going to stay number one by the end unless he lost before the semis, quarterfinals or earlier, and Rafa won the tournament. So was that likely to happen? No, probably what was most likely was Djokovic was going to win. And if he played Rafa in the final, although Indian Wells is a better surface for Rafa to play Djokovic on as compared to the Australian Open, he probably still would have found a way to beat Rafa, and Djokovic would be on one serious winning streak going in the Miami Open. So I think there is a case there. Djokovic likely would have held number one, but why do we play the matches if we can just predict everything that's going to happen? Darren Cahill also said Djokovic should get the credit until the next major, and then I'm a bit unsure of what is the right thing to do. These weeks he would have retained number one. The same goes for Ash Barty. The only problem is no one knows when the next major is going to be. So comment below. What are you thinking is when the next major is going to be? I've got to get out of here. We will be back next week to talk about, on COVID break tennis, Corona break tennis, what is going on with Wimbledon and the rest of the tennis world. Hopefully, there'll be more news, but I'm willing to bet, if I had to put money on it, that we won't know a whole lot more, except that Wimbledon is going to be canceled. See ya!